Hi, good afternoon if you're on the East Coast. Good morning if you're on the West Coast. Good evening if you happen to be in Europe or in Asia. Welcome to the May 2022 TSCA 3030. Our topic today is more on forever chemicals. Forever chemicals are the PFASs, right? And this is actually our third webinar on PFAS substances in as many years. There are very, very fast-moving events in the US, in Europe, and perhaps elsewhere with respect to PFAS substances. And so we thought that it would warrant and merit an additional webinar, even though I think the last one was in November of 2021. There's a lot of litigation, particularly with respect to the presence of PFAS substances in groundwater and in firefighting foams. And so there's a lot of activity on the litigation front, and there's also a lot of activity on the regulatory front. Next slide. Yeah, hi, I'm Herb Stryker, and I've given a lot of these. And I'm actually the only presenter today. And that may be good news or bad news, depending on your perspective. Next slide, please. So just to sum up some of the key developments, some of these we've mentioned in our November 2021 TSCA 3030, EPA has a PFAS roadmap. And why? Because it's felt by the agency that the risks posed by PFAS, polyfluorinated alkyl substances, require that the agency attack the problem on multiple fronts at the same time. EPA believes that it must leverage all of its statutory authority to address the issues involving risk of PFAS to human health and the environment. There are three objectives under this PFAS roadmap: research, restrict, and remediate. Next slide, please. What does research mean? Well, it's as is apparent from the word. EPA is committed to building a database on individual PFAS substances and to define categories of PFAS to allow the agency to establish toxicity values and methods. Now, the agency has already issued human health assessment documents on a number of the PFAS substances. Some have undergone a scientific advisory board review. Some are still pending SAB review. And the points of departure and the RFDs, or the reference dose factors, cardiac reference doses, and for PFAS substances that EPA has examined are substantially lower by orders of magnitude than what was developed during the Trump administration. As you may be aware, the Trump administration also issued some PFAS health assessment documents, and those were rescinded by the Biden administration. The Biden administration has now come up with their own assessments. Some are in draft, some have been finalized. And the RFDs are extraordinarily low. And this has resulted in things like a draft proposal for a safe level in drinking water, which is in the parts per trillion level. So this is really, becoming a kind of very, very important area. So secondly, under research is to increase scientific understanding on the universe of PFAS substances. There are apparently thousands of them. The sources of environmental contamination by PFAS, how people and the environment are exposed, and the effects both to people and the environment. To expand research on current and emerging remediation, treatment, and cleanup control technologies, treatment technologies for PFAS contamination, and to conduct research to understand how PFAS contributes to environmental justice concerns. Next slide, please. Second objective is restrict. So first you research, then you restrict. And on the restriction prong, the four sort of core objectives are to use action under all the statutory authorities are available to the agency to control and prevent PFAS contamination and exposure. And so there are activities under the Clean Water Act. There are activities under CERCLA, Superfund Act. There are activities under TSCA. There are activities under the Pesticide statute. And so EPA is looking at the full range of its statutory authorities to control the PFAS problem. Second objective under strict is to put the responsibility on those that are responsible for the exposure and contamination. Third, to establish voluntary programs to reduce PFAS use and release. And fourth, to prevent or minimize PFAS discharges and emissions in all communities, and as well as communities where there are susceptible subpopulations or where there are environmental justice concerns, regardless of income, race, or language barriers. Next slide, please. Second thing that is going on is there is a national PFAS testing strategy, which was published in October 2021. And I've listed the substances, which is really a small universe of the things that are considered PFASs, which, as I mentioned, are thousands of substances, that the agency plans to focus its testing on, and at some point issue test orders, testing rules for these substances. And these are some of the more common ones, but not necessarily so. Next slide, please. Well, so one of the things that's going on is the question is, what is a PFAS? Which is really quite an important question, because the definition of PFAS defines the scope of what EPA will be looking at. So the Office of Pesticide Programs and Toxics, which would include both chemicals and pesticides, has a working definition, and that definition is any chemical substance or mixture that structurally contains the unit that I've set forth here. So it looks like at least one carbon has two fluorines, and that's adjacent to another carbon that has one fluorine. And so that's how you get the polyfluoro. There are many, many different definitions of PFAS, but this is the one that OPPT has settled on, at least for the time being. That definition appears on EPA's website in the TSCA PFAS testing strategy, which I just talked about, and also in the proposed TSCA Section 8 rule. Don't forget, there is a proposed TSCA Section 8 rule to call in information on PFAS, manufactured imported PFAS substances as such in mixtures and in articles. Very, very broad reporting rule. There's still a lot of discussions with the Small Business Administration. It's still under O&B review. Hasn't yet been finalized. The agency hopes to finalize sometime this year. But there is this proposed TSCA Section 8A rule, a pair rule, and we've actually presented on that pair rule perhaps a year and a half ago. So that's same definition appears in that proposed rule, and also appears on the Pesticide Office's webpage on PFAS and pesticide packaging, which is a topic that we'll speak about a little later in this webinar. As expected, the NGOs seek a broader definition. And in fact, they've getting some support in the House, in Congress. There was an amendment attached to the House version of the 2022 Defense Authorization Bill, which would have defined PFAS as any chemical that contains at least one fully fluorinated methylene carbon atom, which is a very, very broad definition. And that measure was not adopted by the Senate, at least during the current composition of the Congress. May change in the next elections. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the definition determines the scope. It's very important to understand that. There was a study by university researchers at two universities. I think one of them was Boston University, and they applied 9 different PFAS definitions. So there's one the EPA has on the pesticide program. There's another definition in Europe. There are some definitions that have been kicked around by academics. So there are 9 different PFAS definitions out there. And they've applied those PFAS definitions to some 360 organofluorine drugs, or these are pharmaceuticals that contain fluorine somewhere in the molecule, to draw conclusions on how broadly the definitions would capture chemicals of concern. And the study concludes that the OPPT, Office of Pesticide Prevention Toxics, definition would leave out a wide range of these fluorinated pharmaceuticals. Now, obviously, pharmaceuticals are not on the TSCA, but I think the basic point is that if you take a universe of organofluorine compounds and you apply the OPPT definition, that only captures a small subset of the organofluorine compounds. Now, this is important. The NGOs are really quite in a little fight here. So what the NGOs did, they filed I guess the NGO Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, or PEER, which is a watchdog group. They filed a Freedom of Information Act request asking for documents that underlie the OPPT process for defining PFAS. And they claim that OPPT has withheld some documents, have withheld documents. And so they've actually brought suit under the Freedom of Information Act to compel the agency to disgorge the various documents that underlie their development of the PFAS definition. So the NGOs consider this very, very important. I guess what they want to do is they want to get this information out of EPA so they can peddle that on Congress, and perhaps this time get the Senate to also agree with this very, very broad definition that was in the House bill that I just mentioned. Next slide, please. Other things going on with respect to PFAS. I mentioned earlier that the Pesticide Program Office has been examining the presence of PFAS in pesticide products. Now, where do PFAS come into pesticide products? Assuming the pesticide products themselves are not fluorinated. It has to do with fluorination of high-density polyethylene, either the resins or the containers in which some pesticides are packaged. There was a finding, again by the watchdog group PEER, which I just mentioned, that at least one pesticide, which is, I guess, a mosquito larvicide product, contained certain level of some of the PFAS substances at very, very low levels. And that was then tracked down to the process used to make the HDPE containers, which involves fluorination of either the resins or the containers themselves. I think presumably mostly the resins. And that resulted in some very, very low-level contamination of the contained pesticide product with certain of the PFAS substances, very, very low level, in the pesticide product itself. And EPA has actually done a fairly extensive study of that. You can find that on their website. They've done a fair number of extraction studies and measurement studies. The detection limits are very, very low. And you can read on their website the results of all their work. In March 16, 2022, EPA issued an advisory to companies that they consider the manufacturing of these PFAS contaminants from the fluorination of polyolefins, HDPE, I guess resins, to be a significant new use under their 2020 long chain perfluoroalkyl carboxylate, or LCPFAC, significant new use rule. Now, how did EPA come to that conclusion? Well, first of all, EPA takes the position that these contaminants are actually byproducts of the manufacturing process. Now, under SNUR, byproducts are not exempt unless they're disposed of, incinerated, or used to extract other substances from them as a feedstock. And so EPA takes a position these contaminants are byproducts. In my view, that's not correct. In my view, the contaminants are impurities. So what's the difference between a byproduct and impurity? Well, I mean, I think conceptually, an impurity is something which stays with the product, whereas a byproduct is something which is separated from the product. If you look at sort of byproducts, they're not subject to the SNURs. They can be disposed of or used as a feedstock. etc. And that wouldn't make any sense if they were impurities, because you certainly wouldn't use the substance that you're producing as a feedstock. And you wouldn't just simply dispose of the substance you're producing simply because it contained a PFAS impurity. So the agency seems to conflate the definition of byproduct with that of impurity. Impurities are exempt from these snurs. And so I see that as overreaching by EPA. There have been a fair number of claims of late that the Biden administration is acting unlawfully in a number of quarters. We wrote extensive comments on some of the risk evaluation rules, arguing that the agency's whole chemical approach is unlawful. That's been picked up by various trade associations. So I think this is another example of agency overreach. Next slide, please. There's been a fair amount of state activity, largely in the food packaging, cosmetic area, and elsewhere. Most of the state bans on PFAS have been focused on intentionally added PFAS substances. However, Maine has issued legislation that would, it's very, very broad. It would prohibit the distribution and use of pesticides contaminated with PFAS, and that actually is phased in, although the actual year I think that it phases in is not clear from legislation on its face. But that's a very, very broad state bill, which is worth thinking about, and also worth looking at what other states plan to do going forward. So if you're concerned about PFAS substances, I think you not only have to look at EPA activity, you have to look at state activity as well. Very, very important. And there are a large number of bills dealing with PFAS substances in food packaging and elsewhere. There are a lot of concerns of people thinking about, well, what's the story with fluorinated polymers? Are they going to be captured and all this stuff? As you know, the REACH restriction is being proposed, a very, very broad restriction on PFAS substances. And no question in Europe, it'll include fluoropolymers. So the question about fluoropolymers and whether they'll be captured either by anything EPA is doing or by state legislation is something that a lot of companies are thinking about and monitoring carefully. Next slide, please. What else has EPA done? Well, we reported in November that EPA is sort of going around systematically removing and deleting the various approvals that it's had given over the years to PFAS substances. So, for example, EPA announced a moratorium on low volume exemptions for PFAS substances. And I'll talk a little bit later what's going on in terms of PMNs for at least fluoropolymers during the Biden administration. So that was one thing. So they announced they would no longer accept any low volume exemptions for PFAS substances. They also announced that they would ask companies to voluntarily withdraw existing LV approvals for PFAS substances. But another thing they've done recently, in March, they announced that they were going to be removing the PFAS substances that were on their safer choice ingredient list. If you know about something about the Safer Choice program, it's an EPA program that basically gives you a certification and a logo that you can put on your consumer product, saying that your product is a safer choice product because it contains ingredients that are on the Safer Choice ingredient list. And a lot of companies like to get their substances on that list. And so EPA apparently initially listed at least 2 PFAS substances on the Safer Choice ingredient list in 2012, based on the data that was available to the agency at that time and the state of knowledge at that time. And so it's remarkable how things change in a decade. But now EPA is in the process of removing these chemicals from the list. And the way they do that is they first mark the chemical with a gray square. That provides notice to chemical manufacturers and product manufacturers that these chemicals no longer be allowed for use in products that are candidates for the Safer Choice label. and then any Safer Choice certified products will have to be removed from the market or reformulated unless health and safety data can be developed and provided to justify continuing their use, which I doubt EPA will accept any of that data. And so they were announced in March 16th, and the chemicals will then be removed 12 months after that. So by March 2023, those two chemicals should be removed from the list. Next slide, please. Fluoropolymers. I talked about fluoropolymers. As you know, some fluoropolymers still qualify under TSCA polymer exemption. It's rather interesting. You know, Europe is actually planning to require the registration of certain polymers or polymers requiring registration. And what will the polymers requiring registration be? What kind of polymers will it be? Will it be basically polymers that are that don't meet the European criteria for polymers of low concern? There is some discussion, and I think there's agreement that no fluoropolymer will meet the European criteria of polymers of low concern. But however, some fluoropolymers are still qualify under TSCA polymer exemption. In 2010, remember the polymer exemption was current version came out in 1995. 15 years later, EPA put out a regulation to carve out of the universe of fluoropolymers that will qualify for the TSCA polymer exemption certain fluoropolymers. And these are ones that contain perfluoroalkyl sulfonates, perfluoroalkyl carboxylates, fluorotelomers, or perfluoroalkyl moieties that are covalently bond to either carbon or sulfur atom. That's an integral part of the polymer molecule. Now, why is that? Why they carve those out? Because there was a concern that those would fragment, those moieties, may break off, and then therefore there would be actual PFAS contaminants in the polymer. And now I said I would tell you a little bit about what's been going on with respect to fluoropolymers that have been submitted for PMNs, at least since the Biden administration. I took a look at this, and there have been relatively few, but the ones that have actually gone in, if maybe people have other information, at least the information I have, they've been subject to consent orders, Section 5E consent orders and SNURs. And I took a look at these SNURs at least, and they seem to all require respirators and other PPE, testing triggers, which means you're allowed to produce or manufacture, import only a certain amount, and that triggers testing. Generally disposal only by incineration, and generally no release to water. So if you think about it, EPA is sort of having a kind of a zero exposure scenario for fluoropolymers when people file PMNs. Next slide, please. There are other moves afoot. As you know, the toxic release inventory, or TRI, is not part of TSCA, but it's very closely related to TSCA's, definitions of manufacturing processing. On the same as under TSCA, it's also under the same broad division. OPPT administers the TRI, as we reported in the past. A large number of PFAS substances are subject to TRI reporting. The NGOs have sued EPA over its TRI reporting requirements for PFAS, and they're trying to force EPA to remove exemptions. There are various exemptions under the TRI rules for all kinds of different things. According to the NGOs, only 39 entities reported producing or using the PFAS substances that are subject to TRI reporting in 2020. And that's only for 43 compounds, and only 20 disclosed releases in small volumes. So the NGOs claim that on this basis that numerous manufacturers and processors are not reporting. That's what they claim. In any event, EPA seems to pick up on this. They have commented in a press release that there's a seemingly limited scope of PFAS reporting, and they have contacted companies which they believe may have reported low numbers in error. And they've also announced they plan to have a rulemaking this summer that would, among other things, remove the eligibility of at least one of the exemption, which is the de minimis exemption under TRI. So right now it's 0.1% of PFOA in a mixture. Below that level, the PFOA would need not be reported. And if it's 1% of other PFAS in a mixture below that level, the PFAS need not be reported. Next slide, please. Okay, up previous slide. I'm going to take, they seem to be a huge number of questions here. So I'm going to take a look at these. Geez, a lot of questions. So actually, it seems to be quite a little collogue over here. Somebody said to everyone that the Toxics and Packaging Clearinghouse 2021 revised model regulation states there should be no detectable PFAS in any package or packaging component. Do you know whether any states or other authorities adopted that language or are planning to adopt it? And I think other than Maine, which I think Maine is probably broad enough, because even though Maine has a provision that says only applies to intentionally added PFAS in, let's say, cosmetic packaging, the way they define intentionally added PFAS would include contaminants. And so Maine may be the closest to that. And then somebody said there's no adoption to date, but discussions in New York, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. Not surprised. Interesting to see whether there'll be any exclusion for some of the FDA regulated products, or maybe that's the target of this legislation. And then somebody said no detectable PFAS is very strict language. Well, no, that's no question about that. There seems to be broad agreement about that, and that is great. And there's some discussion here about that no detectable PFAS is a problem. No question about that. And then discussions about analytical capability, discussions about LODs. Well, that's pretty lively discussions here. So I think people are clearly concerned about what's going on at the state level. And, you know, we do monitor that for clients. So give us a call if you'd like us to add you to that project. At a cost, of course. Anyway, we have 161 people here. I think that's terrific. Final thoughts. Well, I mean, this is a very fast-moving area. I mean, I sort of wrote a kind of a memorandum for client November on what's been going on and how that would impact their products. And I got an email this week saying, is this November memo still accurate? And I said, well, nope, I don't know. I mean, we're going to have to take a look at this because there's a lot of activity even since November. And I think that's the point here. There's just a huge amount of activity going on in Europe, going on in the U.S., both the federal and state level. And, you really have to pay attention if you have any, possibility that you have, fluorinated products or fluorinated contaminants in your products. And it's a very, very important area. Next slide. Please join us for the next TSCA 3030, which will be on June 8th. We're going to have a REACH program. We do REACH every other month. And so you haven't probably heard from the REACH people in a long time. That's Alish Patel and myself. But we'll be talking about something. I promise it won't be PFAS on June 8th in terms of what's going on in Europe. As always, there's an OSHA 3030 in May 25th. Next slide. Well, I'm Herbert Stryker. Thank you for your time today. And I certainly appreciate hope you found it useful and informative. Take care, everyone. See you in June. Bye-bye.